Well, good afternoon. I'll start out by showing you a few pictures from my trip in 2013 in July, mid-July 2000, to the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in northeastern Tennessee. Real fast, I'll just run through them. Some of them show the inside of the lab, like the reactor. Pretty interesting. That's, yeah, I remember that's the last one in the series. Um, and that's actually here, right here in the Google map of in Tennessee. And today, though, what I want to talk about is just some current events that have been in the news a lot lately. Um, First of all, I'm going to give you the link in the description to Nicholas Confessore's New York Times very long article, How the Transgender Rights Movement Bet on the Supreme Court and Lost. The Skrmetti case. Actually, the ruling was very much on a technicality about level of scrutiny, strict scrutiny versus relational basis, and um, what actually is a protected class. And it was actually very narrow and a little bit artificial. It did not try to pass judgment very much on the real questions underneath it. Now Trump, of course, is, as you know, during his first change, changed the court makeup, and it's a lot more conservative than it would have been. But in the past, the courts had, particularly even during the first Trump administration, before he had a chance to replace judges, and then later with Biden, the courts have tended to muddle sexual orientation, and gender identity together as if they were one thing. And I think the Bostock decision has something to do with that. Um, and even the Equality Act that has been proposed, that HRC has been proposing, tends to do that. And there's been a pattern of conflating these terms in a way, particularly that gender identity is, as a concept, is lost, doesn't really seem to have a very clear legal meaning. I'm not going to get into the history of it, but I just wanted to point out, I'll give you the link. It will help you to read. It's a very long article in the New York Times, and it'll give you some idea where we're coming from. Um, um, and but but one of the things I wanted to touch on just today as part of a reaction to it is just go back and look at, what are the kinds of legal identities that we should have. What are genuine identities to recognize legally, and what are genuine identities that we have to talk in practice, where a person identifies with a something and wants to be known for that person or their association with some aspect of life or some quality or something. But the most obvious legal identities would be race, strictly biological sex, and 99.9% of the time, it's absolutely obvious what that is. Even with some of the intersex conditions, most of the time, it's very clearly that the person's body biologically has one plan for reproduction or other, even if there was something that happened that was unusual in their development. It's still, they're clearly one or the other almost always. Ethnicity is one, and religion, in a sense, acts as an immutable class, and that for most people in practice, it's tied to their ethnicity. Um, although technically practicing religion would be behavior, an individually chosen behavior, in practice, it's viewed as connected to ethnicity, which isn't chosen. And so, yeah, there's not very much idea argument over recognizing it as a very protected class. Um, but I think we have other kinds of identities, and I think part of the discussion, especially with gender identity, and that's developed over the past few years. And I've talked about in previous videos, but I would say you've got performative identities, like performativity, where your ability to, or your inclination to perform certain activities in life, particularly in relation to how you connect to other people, starts to constitute an identity, or that's how Judith Butler talked about it. And in a sense, Paul Rosenfels had talked about some of this before back in the 1970s. But sexual orientation is the most obvious one. And gender identity, sexual orientation, refers to what you are attracted to in other people as far as physical aspects of their biological sex, where gender identity seems to be a lot more ambiguous. And in practice, it's been defined circular by what the person feels and by what that person's perceptions are of the expected gender roles. But it gets circular because the gender roles are really defined by what the person learns from their parents and their society and everything, and by the society they're living in. So it seems like it's a very nebulous concept. And so that, in my view, is not something that should be on a legal label, sort of like my driver's license. Turn around, my driver's license or my passport. Whereas biological sex, my immutable biological sex, logically would be. So, and I could even understand if with trans persons, if they're an adult and they have transitioned, or they're well on their way to transition, and as an adult, as a purely mature adult, then I think at some point their claim that they really have become the other sex for practical purposes starts to become relevant and maybe could be recognized on legal documents, even though Trump has turned even that back. I think with people that really had fully transitioned, well, we really shouldn't have done that. But the other thing that matters to me is what I would call as a reputational identity. And this really matters a lot to me, what I'm known for doing publicly, which is critical thinking on my blogs, and more recently YouTube channels and books. Of course, the books that I authored that I did on my own. I didn't do them as part of a group. And even music composition, even some music composition that's over there on the you can see it over there on my Casio piano, some music composition. That's mine. And it's strictly mine. And those are things that should be, that I'm very concerned that I be known for what I did and what my own content was and my own thinking was, and that it not just be an extension of some group that I belong to being loyalty and being known for getting rid of, fighting an oppressor group is because I'm a member of an oppressed class. That doesn't sit very well for it to be known only for that. And I see that as kind of, to depend on being a victim is kind of shameful in a way. So that's kind of how I see it. But that's not something that would be a pronoun or my name or would be on a legal document. Also, just think about the fact that when you're growing up, when I was growing up in the 50s, women were, had a salutation, Mr. or Mrs., as to whether their last name had changed when they were married. And if after the 60s and as you got into the 70s, that started to become less important. A lot of women kept their maiden names later on as society moved on. But it used to be that was an identifier, whether you were married, but it was through the salutation. Men didn't have to have it, but there was a presumption, I think, back when I was growing up, the 50s and the early 60s, the men had a social obligation to get married and have children, and that was something that wasn't really negotiable. It wasn't something we said directly to men. It was just something that was understood, and that became, I think, that became a problem in the fact that we weren't completely forthright about what it actually meant to have that kind of a social obligation. I also wanted to just mention a couple of other books that the the visit to Tennessee that show talked about, and to Oak Ridge in 2013. That was made just about after I'd finished the text of this book, the third book, before I went into copy editing. But I just wanted to mention also some of this theory about gender ideology. There's a couple of books by Dansky, The Abolition of Sex, which is how the transgender agenda harms women and girls. And then there's a later book, The Reckoning, by her, which is how the Democrats and the left betrayed women and girls, which follows it. There's also a book I bought at Camera Books on World Pride Weekend, Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism by Amanda Montell, which is about cults. That's something Tyler Mallory, practical screenwriting, talks a lot about, is cults. So I bought that also. But just to get back to just a couple of other topics, why is this thing, this gender, why is particularly the gender identity thing a problem for me? There are kind of three areas. One is that I think is that people who don't have a strong performativity, and that's, in other words, Judith Butler's word, towards the activities associated with their birth sex. The practical manner is that they're seen as inferior to people who do, people who do look good and who are strong in their performance, who carry out their expectations of their birth sex. By being attractive according to the norms of their sex and by marrying and having children. So the people who are not as attractive according to binary sex norms are considered less ideal as life partners, or less ideal for intimate partnerships, and considered to be viewed as sort of second-class people in some ways by, I think, in the back of our minds. We tend not to want to let them bond with us. So the way, heteronormative society treats that is, in the past, was to expect people who were not as polar when it comes to sex, is to stay home and help take care of the people who did have kids, which is what happened, particularly on my mother's side of the family in Ohio. That was two of my mother's sisters never. One of them finally married very late in life, and then the other one, but they both stayed home in Kipton for a long time, actually shared a bedroom. I mean, they didn't really go out and have independent lives very much the way men did. There was a brother who married late in life, but he had a somewhat independent life because he was in the Army in World War II. And went out and ran an import-export company in Cleveland later on, and so forth. It was the uncle who played a role in my life later on, which we'll get into in the book. There's but it's because it really does make life really is difficult in normal heteronormative society for people who don't fit the binary sex norms. So it's natural that the left will want to get rid of the importance of binary sex and come up with a gender identity as a system would seem to make life better for people who aren't as sexually polar. Even think about the movie Eyes Wide Shut, and what that movie says. That Tyler Mallory has a review of it on his site, which he discusses that sexual polarity in Hollywood. That's part of the problem. Then the second thing is that I tend to look at these moral questions in terms of being individual rights and obligations at an individual level as a reflection on the individual. I don't think of groups this way as the way activists do, as being oppressor versus oppressed. And in the LBG and then TQ plus world, with the TQ having become attached to it, particularly in the last 10 years, um, publicly. The transgender part of it and seems to, in some cases, to be a lot more extreme and just demanding of people a normal life. You know, the imposition on women's sports, the imposition in women's spaces sometimes, and the idea that you have to introduce it to minors and teach minors about it in grade school and teach minors a concept like that. And then in the encouraging the use of pronouns and then encouraging everyone to use pronouns and to admit that they could have been trans, even normal people who never had any issue with this or expected to have been expected until recently. It's rolling back now to give their pronouns and go along with it to make trans people feel better. You know, the fact that you need to have other people play your game, that wasn't something that happened very much with the gay community in the past. Although the gay community had its problems, particularly during the AIDS epidemic, which were enormous back in the 80s. And I lived through that. Now, some people on the left will say that if the LGB gives up, divorces the TQ plus, that you're breaking down the solidarity of an oppressed group, and that eventually the right will come for gay people too. So you have to be willing to defend people that you don't completely approve of or agree with in order to protect yourself. You have to have solidarity, and that's very much like labor unions. And I've never belonged to a labor union at all myself. I was a computer programmer, an individual contributor, and I've even worked scab duty one time when I was working for NBC back during the NABIT strike in 1976 when I was in New York. And so I've never experienced having to be activism as part of a group particularly where something doesn't affect me, but I'm expected to sacrifice to help other people when I have nothing personally to gain from it other than just a less likelihood of being oppressed by an oppressor and, an elite class above me than I am now. I sort of became my own elite, I guess. I was privileged enough to do that, even though I was gender nonconforming as a boy. The third thing is that, I do manage a trust. I've talked about it before. Excuse me. And HRC is one of the beneficiaries. I put it on there back in 2012 when I made it a grantor trust. And I had no idea that this trans problem was going to go the way it did, because nobody was talking about it then. Although it was starting to happen a little bit. It wasn't really very visible to me until after we were coming out of the pandemic. I really didn't pay any attention to it at all until maybe 2021. And so, it's a problem for me if I'm expected to help them support something like minors getting puberty blockers, which is many people see as mutilating children. I just can't in my own reputation allow that to happen. I just can't afford to allow that. So I may have to, in July, after my birthday, I'll let things settle down a little bit. I may have to have them removed as a beneficiary because it's a reflection on me if I have anything to do with minors' inappropriate behavior towards minors. And it seems very uncertain. I know there's been a lot of uncertainty that at first it was more approved of, and then later studies, the CAS review, have cast a lot of doubt on whether this should be done. But it's very unclear that you can safely medically help a minor with gender dysphoria avoid puberty and then wait till they're an adult to decide their sex and not ever have a puberty, or do it only artificially with hormones. It sounds very uncertain that that's sound medically. It's a lot more dubious than people were saying. And yet, when you inherit money and you have a trust and you have beneficiaries, you're really supposed to do what the people you inherited from would have wanted you to do, or you're supposed to really go along with the benefit and fight with them, whether you agree with it or not. So it puts you personally in a very tick position, possibly a legally dangerous position, conceivably. And so it's a very sensitive thing for because I feel like I'm supposed to go along with advocating some things that, in the context of the world right now, as it really is right now, are quite extreme, and in some cases on the trans side. And then finally, I just wanted to make a few more comments just about current events. Is that yes, this whole idea of accelerationism. Yes, I'm very concerned. How Trump won the election despite the January 6th, despite his behavior with respect to January 6th and the whole issue, the pardons of people that were, some of them might have been innocent, but some people have been pardoned who obviously behaved criminally, and also is taking money from business leaders and from tech companies. His behavior, I'm very concerned about that. And it seems like the elites actually believe that advanced civilization is going to fall apart and have to start over. So they're kind of bunkering down. And yes, a lot of people on the right think it's very important to have the skills, to start having the skills to survive for a while. If we have, a huge loss of electricity from like a Harrington event style from the sun, or we might be better prepared for that than we used to be. That might not even do as much damage as we say, or perhaps an electromagnetic pulse attack war, from an enemy, which could happen. That society will break down. That the United States will break down into separate regions again. It might. A lot of people seem to think you could break the world back up into city states, or even into intentional communities, like one I visited back in 2012 on Twin Oaks and down around Mineral, Virginia. And that was after their little earthquake, as I remember. Well, there's another one called Acorn in that area. And everybody lives in a commune. Nobody really has a public life outside of the commune, except very few. And one of the questions, there'd be another question about somebody like me that didn't have his own children, that maybe I have a responsibility to bond with someone and take them in and providing for them what I did is a way of having social credit. I haven't really done that, but that would make sense, because normally the way the disadvantaged the less able get taken care of in a society where everyone marries and has children. The tribe takes care of its weaker members through the family structure. And that's how some religious societies, particularly Islam in many parts of the world, works. Islamic society does take care of its disadvantaged, but expects families to do that. And that's one of the reasons why they're so strict in the rules about enforced, sort of mandatory heterosexuality for everyone, because it's a way of carrying on a responsibility for others. We don't, in the West, say that explicitly. We want people to be able to make their own choice in life. But what's happened, particularly since maybe, in 2010, 2011, when we had the Arab Spring, when things looked so promising, it sounded like this was the second part of the Obama years. It sounded like this was going to be a great individualism, but the individualism kind of took off on a wrong track and turned into some twisted aspects of the gender identity issue. So whether individuals like me can continue living the way I have, now I'm 81, whether I pass away before this affects me is a good question. But, if there's karma and reincarnation, and if you really know when you go, if you're still conscious of yourself when you go, just in a different dimension or something, and have to deal with maybe the world still matters after you go. I don't know for sure how this works. I mean, to think that. We've, yeah, I've also just wanted to say I've noticed, that's my fourth point there, that society really could move back towards forced socialization. Like you really have to try to have children and raise a family if you're going to have full rights. We might be going back to that. I know Elon Musk talks like that he wants it that way. I also just wanted to say something else, though. That in some parts of the world, I've talked about age verification, and the Supreme Court's going to rule on that porn website thing and age verification, in which, as by the way, what's expected is that in that case, it's expected that a user verify themselves by registering with the state that they're an adult or something. It's not very practical. Although I think there's some scheme that's been planned for that Las Vegas uses or something to get around it. But um, what what I've noticed is, again, in some parts of the world, particularly Orban in Hungary, where anything having to do with LGBT, either sexual orientation or gender identity, can't be put on the internet in a place that minors can find it, or can't be displayed in public. I don't know what happened to their attempt to have Pride in that law where they were going to punish people who attended Pride if they pulled it up. I don't know what's become of that yet. That would be a good thing to find out. I don't actually know because I haven't heard anything about it in the last 2 or 3 weeks. But Orban seems to think that if young men are exposed to homosexual ideas, they'll be less likely to be interested in heterosexuality and raising a family themselves. And Vladimir Putin seems to think that too in Russia. That seems to be a belief in these authoritarian countries. What I've noticed is that, and I'm looking back on college when I was at William and Mary in 1961, I was thrown out of school. And then in 1966 to 68, when I was a grad student, I lived in a dorm at the University of Kansas. And then when I was in the Army and basic training all the way through being in the Pentagon and being at Fort Eustis, what I've noticed is that in young men that are enthusiastically heterosexual and go out and look for women, what they want to score, they want to have intercourse, they want to have physical satisfaction. I'm trying to keep the language PG-13 here if I can. And it seems like they have an internal drive, and that they're not that attracted to the women that they are having relations with. They just want to score. They only start feeling attracted when they court women and feel they can take care of them, provide for them, and then marry, and then agree, and then do a monogamous marriage with one woman for life, and then expressing their power to have a lineage and then have responsibility for other people that they're going to provide for, and to justify their entrance into public life. When it becomes like that, then they feel the attraction. It's all one package. But when it starts out, it's just simply a sex drive. I didn't have that kind of a sex drive, partly because I didn't develop physically quite enough. And so my brain sort of got in the way of feeling attracted to women, and I idealized men who were more masculine than I was. So that's what drove me to feel what I did. So that was kind of the point I wanted to make. And that's what I've got for today. And I do thank you for listening. I'll be talking about the fourth book soon. And thank you again.